Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at the population figures around the world and see what changes have taken place over the past couple of years. Some of them are very fascinating. My guest is an expert in this area. Today, Mr. John Wilmoth is going to bring us up to date on a recent report that he did. Mr. Wilmoth is a U.S. national and the director of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations, commonly called Desa, and he is in the population division. Previously, Mr. Wilmoth served as a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, in Berkeley, California. John Wilmoth, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill.
We could have you on probably every 6 weeks or something. You've got all kinds of interesting things going on. But before we get into your interesting report, I mentioned DESA, the Department for Economic and Social Affairs. What is that very briefly? What's your main mission with that department?
Well, DESA is a department of the UN Secretariat, and it's the place where actually we work on all aspects of the development agenda. So if you think about it in terms of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals across economic, social, and environmental aspects, DESA is the only part of the UN system that kind of follows everything across all 17 goals. And so I think it's the place where you have the most kind of comprehensive perspective on development issues. So I mean that's the general mission, but you know our division is just one piece of that. We look at the population trends for the world, and we track them, how they change, and every 2 years we do an update of this work that you mentioned.
Which is very fascinating, very interesting, and very important too. I'm sure many people are reading your report and they're finding it to be extremely interesting. I might mention too that our viewers can go to your website, unpopulation.org, to get more information on what we're talking about. Yeah. And I assume your report is on there too.
Sure. Yes. Everything can be downloaded. We don't print much anymore. It's mostly, mostly for download. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, the title of the report is World Population Prospects 2019 Highlights. Well, let's start off there. I think there were 10 major highlights of that report. Let's just start off with the first one. The world's population continues to increase, but growth rates vary greatly across regions. What did you find in that out of that finding?
Well, sure, the global population continues to grow. It's about 7.7 billion today. And by 2030, it'll be up to about 8.5 billion. And then by 2050, I think we have 9.7, and by the end of the century, 10.9 billion people. Now these are projections. We don't know exactly where that will be, but the UN has done pretty well, in fact, in projecting global population over the next few decades. If you look back historically, they've done a good job. The method works fairly well at getting reasonably close to what the eventual number will be. But you know, it's important to emphasize that growth continues. You know, the world is still growing. We're going to have significant further growth of the human population from around 7.7 billion up to almost 11 billion people. So we're going to add more than 3 billion more people to this planet. And but at the same time, the pace of growth is slowing down. The growth rate is moving down eventually to zero. You know, we project that eventually this growth will end, and that global population will either kind of reach a stable level or maybe even decline somewhat in the future. And we're already seeing this at the country level. You know, for some countries, they've already kind of reached peak population and are now slowly declining in size. And China will decline between now and 2050. The size of the Chinese population is expected to decline by about 2%. So, you know, even for the world's largest country today,
they're going to slow down.
But one result of that, of course, is that they will no longer be the world's largest country.
And India will be.
India will take over as the largest country probably around 2027 is our current projection of where that crossover might actually occur.
You mentioned about the slowing of the population increase, shall we say. What are some of the factors attributing to that? Why are people having fewer children?
Well, it does come down to having fewer children. Ultimately, that's what growth happens because we control the death rate basically, and we extend life and we keep people alive. You know, children don't die as much in childhood. Women don't die in pregnancy and childbirth. And you know, basically, humans have been very successful in addressing premature mortality before old age, however you want to define old age exactly, but we all have some idea that you should live to some ripe old age, and now that's true for a high percentage of people in most countries. And we continue to make improvements, and that causes the growth. But then what brings the growth to slow down, that's the reduction in the fertility level, so that people come to perceive that for various reasons, there's no longer the same motivation to have really large families. And a single couple can replace themselves and therefore contribute to zero growth if they have just around 2 children on average, and those children are going to survive most likely and to replace their parents. So it's the gradual decline in the fertility rate, and we speak of it in terms of what's the average number of children, actually the average number of births or live births that a woman will have over her lifetime. And that number is around 2.5 children per woman today, 2.5 births per woman, live births per woman over a lifetime on a global scale, about 2.5. And it will continue to fall to around 2.2 children by 2050, I believe. Sometimes these numbers get a little confused in my head.
They're very close.
But the gradual decline in the fertility level, and this is happening all across the world. This is the demographic transition, this process of change. First the longer life, then the smaller families, causing this period of rapid population growth in between. This is happening all over the world. And but it's taking place at different times in different parts of the world. In some parts of the world, this transition has happened, and growth rates are very low or even negative. In some parts of the world, we're really in that high growth phase, like much of sub-Saharan Africa is in that high growth phase, and that will come to an end as fertility rates continue to decline. But there's very clear evidence that that is happening. It's just a question of how fast that will continue. And so our projections are based on the speed of decline, and what matters is what we assume about the speed of decline in fertility. And to make those decisions for our projections, we look at the historical record, and everything that we do is based on past experience and data from the past, and taking that information as a basis for predicting what may happen and the speed of change that may happen in the future.
Exactly. And as I recall, I think it's 2.1 children for just to maintain the current population.
That's
more
right.
or less, roughly, we'll say, and if we get down to 2.2, you're hovering pretty close to that 2.1 or getting below that. I've heard people say too over the years that you mentioned a large number of these too, but some of the factors are that we have an urbanization trend taking place. People are moving from the rural areas where if you are not working a farm or a rural setting or something, you maybe don't need as many children. You mentioned about children not dying or we're living longer, that type of thing. And a lot of people are saying it's too expensive to have children. I don't know if that factored into it or not, but it costs, according to the experts, a lot more to have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 kids today than it did 40 years ago. And I don't know if that factored in or not.
Oh, certainly. But there's a whole range of changes that take place as countries become more economically developed. Education is a major factor here. As people become more educated and therefore their value in the workplace depends more and more on being educated. And that means that, people probably delay the formation of families by a few years. And then, for women in particular, they may be more involved in labor market activities, and so that also is a disincentive to having large families at least. And so, but we're now in a situation where in many countries, people are not having as many children as they would like to have. It's gone in the opposite direction. It's, in some countries we're concerned that maybe they don't have access to family planning and they're having more children than they really want to. And there are other countries where it appears that people would like to have around 2 children, and they're only having on average in some countries less than 1.5, in some cases almost just above 1. So those are the kind of extreme cases when the average fertility level falls below 1.5 births per woman over a lifetime. That's really a very low level, and that's what leads eventually to population decline, like what's happening in Japan.
Well, in the United States too, as I understand it, to some degree, not like it is in Japan, but it's starting to level off a bit or slow down quite a bit.
The fertility rate in the U.S. has been just slightly below 2 children per woman for the last several decades. So it's not as extreme as in Japan and some countries of Eastern or Central Europe, where it's been down below 1.5 in many cases. And the U.S., so the U.S. has a fertility level that's a little bit below the replacement rate, but then it also has an inflow of migrants that's been happening over many years and which continues. And those two can kind of balance each other to some extent. There's some countries that, in fact, there's a whole list of countries that were it not for migration, they would be declining in size. But with migration, the in-migration that's happening, that kind of makes up for the small loss of population that's happening because of the number of deaths exceeding the number of births. So there are different factors that come into this, but for the global trends, by far the most important thing is the trend in the fertility level. That's what drives long-term population trends overall. But for some countries now, migration has become an important component of growth because the birth rate is now so low.
When we come back after our break, we want to be sure and talk about the declining population and what it means to the safety net systems, the social safety net systems, and that type of thing, because that may be a situation. It is happening in certain countries. But let's take a little break and we'll be right back.
Thank you, Bill.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website, you have a computer and you like our shows and you'd like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're talking about an international issue that impacts everybody, and that is population, because we have 7.7 billion people on the planet, and we're getting an update on some of the population trends from my guest, Mr. John Wilmoth. Mr. John Wilmoth is the Director of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs Population Division at the United Nations. John, let's jump right into that. We're talking about the declining populations. I'm thinking back in the 30s, I guess around 35, just take the U.S. as an example, when the Social Security Act was created, and at that time there were it was way up there, like 45, 50 workers for every one that was retiring. Today it's like 3 to 1, so we've seen a decline of the workers contributing to the system. How would that impact, or will that factor into what you're talking about as we have declining populations? Will there be a smaller revenue base for cities and countries to operate? Will there be a lack of skilled people? Or what will be some of the effects of that?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between two things that are going on at the same time, or one is happening everywhere and one is only happening in some places. The thing that's happening everywhere is that populations are starting to age, or they're already quite aged. So even in sub-Saharan Africa, the average age has started drifting upward in most countries. And in some countries, this has been going on for many decades, and as much as a quarter of the population is over age 65 in some places like Japan. And many other countries are headed to that kind of situation where up to a quarter of the population will be in the older age ranges. And so there's concern about the effects of population aging just because the shift of the age structure to having more and more people at older ages, and that's where you get to this issue of the support ratio, which is we talk about how many workers there are per older person. And that just kind of gives you an idea of the balance between those two populations, and as you see that number changing over time, you realize that, well, now each worker has to be responsible for providing production to support more older people than they were in the past. Well, this is partly compensated by the fact that the child population kind of starts to decline, and so the society's obligations to support people who are in an age range where they may need that kind of support It shifts from younger ages to older ages. But the needs of older people and of younger people are obviously quite different, and the way that we deal with social support for older people and younger people is quite different. So population aging on its own has enormous consequences. But in some ways, the best situation that we can hope for at this point is if the fertility rate stays around 2 children per woman, then populations age, but they don't decline in size. They kind of get to a stable size, and the age distribution shifts upward, and that presents its own set of challenges. But when fertility levels fall to really quite low levels, well below 2 births per woman over a lifetime, then we tend to see not only rapid aging of the population, but at some point decline, where the number of births does not keep up with the number of deaths in the population. And at that point, populations, they're not only not growing, it's negative growth at that point. And we don't have a lot of experience with what that means. And I think this is one of the things that we're going to learn more about over the next few decades as more and more countries move into the situation. But I think there were a lot of negative predictions about what was going to happen with Japan and the Japanese economy in this situation. And some of those negative prognostications didn't really come to pass. Human societies are incredibly adaptable, and we can learn to live in a different population arrangement. We can learn to live with more people on the planet and with much older populations, but it requires a considerable effort of adaptation. So just for example, as the population becomes older, then you're faced with issues of how to pay for old age pension systems and health care. Universal health care is more common among older populations, like in the United States and some others. But this is expensive, but there are ways to address the issues, and one is to get more people into the labor force. There are certain groups that have traditionally been excluded from the labor force, women in particular. So if we're concerned about the number of workers compared to the number of older people, well, increase the number of workers, and that's partly can be done by bringing in groups that have been excluded. And it can also be done by changing habits in terms of when people retire. The United Nations, when I joined the organization in 2013, it had a retirement age of 62. Since then, that number has changed. It's gone up to 65. And many countries have done this as well. And my advice would be that they do it in a gradual way, not all at once, and maybe move it up by a month every couple years, so that people have a time to adapt and to change. But with lengthening life expectancies, we could expect that some of that longer life would be spent working a little bit longer. It's not unreasonable. If life expectancy goes up, then we can expect people may want to work longer. Not everybody wants to retire at exactly the retirement age. So we can also kind of find an opportunity in this in terms of helping older people to realize their ambitions. Many of them want to work and continue being a part of the active society. So population aging presents real challenges. Population decline, I think, presents even more challenges, because then you have a situation where the infrastructure was for a population at a certain size, and now it's declining. Normally we're worried about adding infrastructure as the population is growing, but declining populations and how to deal with them and what that means in terms of the turnover of jobs and availability, opportunities for younger people, it's less clear.
It certainly is, yes. And that brings up another issue too, as the population declines or advances, whichever the case might be. What does that do as far as sustainability, as far as the utilization of resources, the ability to not to destroy the environment but preserve? We talk about climate change now. How does that contribute to the whole climate change discussion?
Well, I think when we talk about this, we have some countries are growing, others are declining in size. It's very important to remember that on a global scale, we're talking about growth. The decline is a few countries, small levels of decline, but we're seeing still fairly rapid growth in some parts of the world, and that's going to continue. And like I say, we're going to add 3 billion more people probably by the end of the century. So really, I would focus on growth. And what does growth mean in terms of sustainability? And you know, it's one of several challenges. You know, it's not just the growth of the population, it's also the growth of income and the growth of consumption per person. You know, it's not just how many people there are on the planet, it's how much each one is consuming, how they're eating, whether, you know, how much meat is in their diet. That has an enormous impact in terms of the our global footprint as a species. So, you know, many things can be done to help adapt to these changes, to make our way of living more sustainable in terms of changing the food system. But the most challenging one is the energy system, really. Moving the energy system to something that's not carbon-based. This is, you know, people can change their diets. That's feasible. We can imagine having a world with fewer meat eaters. It's not, there's no technological impediment. It's just a behavioral change. But you know, the energy system and the reliance on fossil-based fuels, of course, we need some technological breakthroughs as well as social changes. And that's the real challenge, is to address the issues around the release of greenhouse gases, much of which is linked to the burning of fossil fuels, and changing the incentives that are out there that actually, you know, encourage the use of fossil fuels and discourage many greener technologies from developing. So we need to get the bad incentives out of the economic system to kind of push the world toward more sustainable ways of conducting business.
That's absolutely critical. If the planet is going to survive, we've got to get off fossil fuels, and the quicker the better. And we have the technology to do it today. There's not a problem in that area with wind, solar, just a variety of other approaches. It can be done. Toughest question, the last 30 seconds we have, what's your number one takeaway from this study?
You know, I think it's important when people talk about environmental issues. Sometimes they come back to this statement about, well, really the problem is the human population and the growth of the human population. And that's the issue we really have to solve if we want to address sustainability issues. And my response is that, well, growth is to some degree inevitable. The continuing growth of the human population is going to happen. There's no plausible intervention that's going to stop that. And we have to adapt to it. We have to accept the inevitability of further growth of the human population. And that means we have to think harder about what we can do to reduce per capita impacts. You know, we're going to have more people, so how do we reduce the impact of each individual person? It just underlines the inevitability of population growth, underlines the importance of changing how we each act individually and what our impact is.
And that's exactly true, and how we reduce our carbon footprint, because it all ties into this. And again, it's not a matter of numbers, it's not a numerical situation, but it's how much we consume, how much waste how much do we destroy the planet, how many resources do we use in a non-sustainable way. But John Wilmoth, it's a fascinating study, and I know that many people will certainly want to go to your website, unpopulation.org, to get more information on it. And I look forward to another update in the not too distant future on this and some of the other interesting issues and topics that you're dealing with, because you have some very interesting statistics, and I'm sure you're never bored for anything to do. But I want to thank you so much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay, my pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.